Good evening, students and listeners. I welcome you to a lecture on a subject matter of sociology, which is, part of the syllabi of sociology, BA, and also MA courses. And apart from MA course, we have one more course as one of the courses of MPhil sociology. So today, the topic, as you might have known it, tribal ethnicity and social movements, will be covering most of these areas. Particularly this aspect, this very topic, relates to, if we consider BA courses, it relates very much to ESO 12 and ESO 14. BA courses of ESO 12 and ESO 14. And in MSO, there are also so many courses that relates to tribal ethnicity and social movements. And those courses are found in MSO 001, MSO 004, and also in some other courses which are briefly dealt. And introduced this year, the MPhil course has one optional course on social movements. So those students who have the opportunity to listen to this lecture will also benefit for their courses. I'm talking of the MPhil students. Well, this is not a very new topic, and yet this is quite a confused and a perplexed, or rather complex topic. Because when you talk of tribal or ethnicity or even social movements, there are lots of understandings, perspectives on this, and it is unlikely that the problem of the definition of ethnicity, the conception of ethnicity, and even the definition or the conception of what is tribe, what is not non-tribe, what is indigenous, what is not indigenous, will, I think, go a long way. And today we'll try to touch some of these issues, elements that will come up from this topic, tribal ethnicity and social movements. What I would like to do is to clarify some of the definitions and concept of tribe or tribal. Then we shall also understand the concept of ethnic group or ethnicity. Then we can also understand social movements, and thereon we can understand what is that is called tribal ethnicity vis-a-vis social movements. And we can take up some case studies if we have time in our deliberation. Well, let's begin with what is tribe, because if we don't understand these concepts, it will be very difficult to understand tribal ethnicity. So in brief, I'll just give some gist, some cues so that listeners can understand the matter that has been already, programmed. A tribe is understood in many ways, but if we go back to the derivation of this term. It has been used many centuries back, but it is used in a different, connotation. The way the notion of tribe being understood many centuries ago, and the kind of conception of tribe today is not the same. For example, about 3rd or 4th BC, we have some record of, the notion of tribe, which was not called tribe, but it was called something like tribus in Latin term. And in archaic French, they would call it tribu. So these terms are somewhat related to what we call tribe today. And I think the derivation that we have a term called tribe in the recent centuries come from this archaic, very old usage. When the word tribus in Latin term would mean a tripartite division, that means 3 divisions of the ancient Roman state. In about the 3rd or 4th century BC, in the old Roman state, people would use it as tribus, which would mean 3 subdivisions, and one of them is Latin. They divide the divisions of the society according to their understanding. And thereon later we find in some other usages also. But even before those, about the same time maybe, in Hebrew tradition, as we also find in some biblical writings, we find the use of tribe in what today in English is called tribe, because the Israelites were said to have had 12 tribes, and it was mentioned. That was in the Old Testament. So in this text also, Hebrew tradition also, there was a notion called tribe. But now, the usage in the modern days have, gone through lots of transformation. And of course, the primordial and the old usages are quite relevant to even today's usage, because even today, the definition of tribe becomes very difficult for anthropologists and sociologists, because the usages are not the same. And to give a very brief and definite definition becomes more difficult. Earlier it was used as, say, by different authors in some different ways, like a community between the bands and the civilized and civilizations. That means they're in between the primitive societies which are not well organized and the modern civilizations. But now we find that the definition cannot accommodate what we call tribe today, and this is obviously because of the kind of understanding and also transformation that has taken place in this many centuries or decades now. Tribe, for the Europeans, would mean a culture, a community, or a nation, or sometimes race, they want to use the ethnic term, which is softened for race, and would like to use tribal in some way. So tribe, even some centuries ago, would mean a cultural entity, a biological entity. Even today, it is, but when it comes to ethnicity, we'll also come to know that there are some perspectives which would define it in terms of political community, which are not only, cultural or social community. And the Europeans, these tribes are those people who are non-Europeans. And this was the whole conception of, tribe. The Orientals, those communities who are not in the mainstream, the colonized people, and who live in the in isolation, maybe in the forest or some isolated places, and those communities who are pushed into the peripheries, and those communities that have the belief of their ancestor, their culture, and also the homogeneity, and also economically, say, some sort of independence. And politically speaking, most of the statesmen or even scholars would agree that at one time the tribals were also having a polity, a political unit, a political setup, which is not quite like the modern state or some other forms, but they have a unit which can govern themselves, which can take care of their everyday lives, and some are organized, some are not organized. So they are divided in terms of even political, setup, the politically ordered, and those who cannot have this political setup themselves, which are loose in terms of administrative setup. Well, so today what we call tribes is contested by some, or even the UN would use it as indigenous peoples. But the UN would use it two terms simultaneously, indigenous peoples and tribal peoples. Because when we look into the documents of the UN, or even ILO, since 1957, and we talk of this UN document, we can refer those reports and the documents which are presented, say, sometime in the 80s. Because before the 80s, the definition was not, the working definition was not developed. But whereas the ILO had already developed for their administrative and for their developmental purposes, say from 1950s. And in 1957, they brought out a definition on indigenous peoples. And it was, contested by some. However, there are no better definitions so far brought about. And so today, what we call the indigenous peoples or the tribal peoples would still endorse the definitions, the working definition developed by the United Nations. Now, these indigenous peoples and tribal peoples are not the same, or sometimes the same, because in some contexts, the tribals of one place is not indigenous to the other place where they would immigrate. This is one point clarified by the UN documents. And this is quite true also in many cases, maybe in Asia, in America, and in some other places in in Africa also. Because the so-called indigenous peoples, when they migrate to some other place, which is of recent origin or whatever, where people had already, been settled, they become latecomers, they become migrants, and so they cannot be called, indigenous to that place. So sometimes they would use these two terms, indigenous peoples and tribal peoples. But otherwise, the term indigenous peoples and tribal peoples are also used interchangeably. Now, in India, say there are about 100 million tribals, but it is used not as tribes or tribals, but it is used as settled tribes, STs, which means this is a legally recognized or legally used term after the President's order from 1950. Such tribes, such communities, which the President of India thinks with some criteria that one is a tribe or a tribal, they are recognized. And the recognition is still going on today. And we have today so many tribal groups or settled tribes. If you go to the latest list, it exceeds more than 600 tribes. Some would list around officially 635 tribes, and which is about 100 million. And so in India, there is quite a lot of tribal communities found, and they are spread to all parts of the country. Of course, in some areas, the concentrations are much more, especially in central India, then western India, then northeast India. Of course, there are some other tribal groups in the southern and even northern part of the country. Now, what is ethnicity? Now, ethnicity has been understood in many ways. It is understood as a derivation of ethnic group or ethnic. When we say ethnic group, we say a community by nature, or by some would call it natural selection. They exist as they are, so they are called ethnic group. But then when it comes to the term ethnicity, ethnicity is the quality of being an ethnic or belonging to an ethnic group. In a way, this is a psychological term, and some would use it that when it is ethnicity, it becomes a political community, which means they are conscious of what they are. It is not as just seen by others, but they are also conscious of what they are, and most of the theorists would say, like Barth would say, they would maintain boundaries of we and the other. So when we go through these community researches and literature, we find so much of those boundaries of communities in different parts of the world, especially when it is in a conflict-ridden societies, when especially conflict occurs. We find a profound lines of or delineation of the boundaries or ethnic boundaries, social and cultural boundaries. They would define themselves, They would say we are one and others are foreigners or aliens. So the kind of definition would mean that it is self-ascription, as some theorists would say, and some would say this, it is not only through self-ascription, but it is also through construction, or it is also through negotiation. So there are three main approaches, namely the Primordial Approach, as propounded by theorists like Clifford Kirch, and the second one would be Instrumentalist Approach, Frederick Barthes and others would be there, Paul Prass and so on. And the third one will be a combination of both, which they use it as Constructivist Approach. And after that also there are some theories and perspectives, but they have not, for now we can just confine it to these three main approaches. Primordial, according to Clifford Kirch and some others, would believe that this ethnic group or ethnicity emerged, or they exist, not because of this political or some economical or whatever reasons, but for them it is socio-biological. They say it is through natural selection. They have been endowed by nature, and when a community lives together who are related to each other, or may not be related, but they say it is related by, their physical affiliations, by genetics. So these physical features aspect is very important, and it is also social. So socio-biological would be the shortest way to understand this primordial approach or model. And some are not satisfied with this kind of approach of understanding ethnicity, so they would talk something else, think in terms of instrumentalist model or approach. For them, instrumental is the ethnic maneuvers. They say ethnicity or an ethnic group can be expanded, the membership can be enlarged, and memberships can attain from some other groups through affiliations and all that. So in other words, ethnicity is a term which is malleable, as Frederick Barthes would use it. That means there is elasticity of that ethnic group, to expand, or even they can even become smaller if some of the members would withdraw and join some other, groups, communities. So they believe that it is a matter of, many political maneuver. It is a matter of the elites using the minds of the people, playing with the minds of the people, or for their advantages, say for elections, or for some other, objectives which they have in their mind. So this is one group of thinkers thinking about the kind of, concept on ethnicity. And the third one is almost a synthesis of this earlier two, approaches. They call it Constructivist Approach. Here it includes both subjective and objective. To the first one, Primordial Approach, they would also take some, and they would take some also from the instrumentalist or situationalist approach. They say an ethnic group or ethnicity exists or come into being, and they live along with negotiations of the partners, of the members. There are negotiations of whether one belongs to that group or whether one does not belong to that group. So constructivists would believe that there is always a process of negotiations among the members also. And if some members are acceptable or accepted, they are accepted into the community. And if some are not accepted by the community, then they are not. And so they have to see for some other affiliations or an ethnic group themselves. So this is interpretive or socio-cultural in nature, and this approach is also, contested by some, that even constructivists are constructed not only by the insiders, by the native people, by the community themselves, but it is also constructed by the analysts. This is the word of, Thomas Helen. He would say that it is also the analysts, the researchers, the outsiders who construct the ethnicity of that ethnic group. So there are two things. One is the construction by the people themselves, by the community themselves, by the members themselves, and the other one, drawing or constructing the image or the, picture of that society, the definition of the group, by the researcher, by the one who sees from outside and who is an outsider. So this is Erickson's way of looking at it. And those people are Cohen, and then we have Jenkins, Richard Jenkins, and many more belong to this constructivist approach. Now, this is ethnicity that we are talking about. And now, when it comes to tribal ethnicity, we find tribe is an ethnic group. And tribe, when it becomes politically conscious, or when they become conscious of being a tribe, and when they maintain boundaries of we and the other, then we see that ethnicity, tribal ethnicity, has already occurred. If they are not thinking in terms of their political entity, in terms of their social consciousness of being a tribe vis-a-vis the neighboring tribal or communities, then they would just remain as tribe, as they see and as others would see as tribe. Then we also have, close to ethnicity, tribalism. Tribalism even within a larger ethnic group, or tribalism between or different tribal groups. So inter-tribalism, intra-tribalism would take place. So ethnicity, when we talk of ethnicity and tribal, when we connect these two, we are talking about the political consciousness or the social consciousness, cultural consciousness of that tribe or community. And now when we talk about social movements, tribal movements, we find that there are different types of tribal movements taking place in different parts of the world. If we consider the Indian context, there are different tribal movements that we can see. One of them can be development-induced tribal movements. It will include their protest against construction of mega dams or dams, which destroys their or which takes away their land, their forest, their livelihood, and even their cultural connections with nature. And so there are lots of protests going on in this country or even in different parts of the world because the so-called developmental projects had to locate on these so-called tribal areas. And because of these projects, dams, and even their, even for militarization, like shooting ranges, the rights of the tribals, the rights of the community are, deprived. And when a mega dam is constructed, it needs a large area, and so many of the villages, tribal areas, would be submerged, even their houses and their, lands and forest. So this kind of, movements are also taking place in different parts of India also, Narmada area also. And if we go to the Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand area, we will also find Orissa. And if we go to the northeast, we will find lots more. Even only in the state of Manipur, we will find 2 macro dams being constructed in tribal areas. And they had been fighting for quite a long time. That is the Tipaimuk area project and the Mapitel Dam project. And this is still, a contested project which the communities, which villages have to be submerged because of this project, have been protesting with so many human rights groups and so many persons concerned for this kind of, what they call anti-people projects. So this is just one. And, taking away lands for what we call some developmental projects, carving out forest lands of the people for some developmental, the so-called developmental projects by the state. This has also caused lots of problems in tribal areas also. So that we can club it under what we call development-induced movements. And the second one that we can consider is autonomy movements. Even in autonomy movements, there will be some categories. One, tribals who are fighting for statehood. That could be one. Earlier, Mizoram was fighting for statehood, and before which they were fighting for something else greater than statehood. But once they come down to what we call statehood demand, they got it sometime in the 70s. Then we also have other Jharkhand, for example, state, they call it, is a tribal majority area supposed to be. And even this, in Manipur, they were fighting for tribal statehood for the hill state. So these are, one, we can club into one where, people, tribals are vying or demanding for attaining statehood. Some of them got it, some of them have not got it, and some may also come up also. And the second one is not in terms of statehood demand, but in terms of some autonomy, in terms of fifth schedules and sixth schedules. These are some powers that the tribals can have to the Constitution of India. Of course, there are differences between fifth and sixth schedules also. Fifth schedules are those scheduled areas and the administrative unit which are, mainly given to those tribal scheduled areas in the mainland India. Whereas sixth schedule are exclusively for those tribal units, tribal groups in the northeast. Of course, the powers of sixth schedule, when we compare it, appears to be, better packaged than fifth schedule. So even fifth schedule people, even those community tribals who are under fifth schedule, would demand for sixth schedule in their areas, like in central, or even western, or even northern Indian belts. They say we want sixth schedule because there is a better package, because there is an administration governed by the tribes, the tribal people, whereas in fifth schedule it is a mixture of the tribal people and some others, and they are loosely, governed, looked after by some advisory council, and the governor, is the head of that the kind of mechanism. So there has been some movements of this sort, and it is still taking place. Whereas even in the sixth schedule area of the northeast, there are some who are demanding for sixth schedule with a better deal. They want to review the sixth schedule, and also that they want sixth schedule. But those people who are already in the sixth schedule provision, they would also demand that the sixth schedule has no deed. So the government of India should review and see that the sixth schedule is beneficial for the tribal people or the people under that autonomous council. And some have gone for statehood demand, and some have got it, like Mizoram got it. Of course, Nagaland did not come under sixth schedule, because Nagaland never wanted sixth schedule, because in Nagaland the movement for sovereignty, independence was so great from so many decades back, even today, that they never accepted the so-called gift of the sender of the Indian Union. But statehood was, given to the what we call Nagaland state. But there are lots of problems because of this Nagaland state, because some would not like it to have this Nagaland state, but they would like to be an independent state, and the movement is still going on. If you have time, maybe I'll come back to that later. And of course, in Assam, the Boro, for example, they were also demanding three things. One, some groups would demand for independent state. Some groups will demand Assam into 50-50. That means within India. The other one is outside India. And the third one is to enhance what they call an arrangement similar to sixth schedule. And even in Korkalen also there is also a kind of sixth schedule. The name is different, but the content is almost the same. And so sixth schedule is also there in Meghalaya also. And most of these members would also feel that there is great deficiency to address the development aspects in a round way, in terms of economy, in terms of culture preservation, in terms of their, even political mobility as they would feel it. So this is one kind of movement which can come under autonomy movement. And the third one is, of course, some would call it self-rule, that in tribal areas there should be the sovereign people and not by the outsiders. The outsiders should not be allowed to exploit them anymore. And so they are fighting for tribal rights, for self-rule, which means it also relates to fifth schedule and sixth schedule also, that provisions should be given to them so that they can also govern themselves, because they feel that they were the real owners of the land, the real owners of the forest, and they should govern themselves, and they should have that power empowered by the center or by the state. And there are also some other movements, human rights movements of the tribals. And of course, this is not exclusively of the tribals, but sometimes of the tribals, sometimes by other communities also. For example, a movement against Armed Forces Special Powers Act, a movement against militarization, a movement against what we call the atrocious and what we call draconian armed, forces acts in India, like what we have POTA and some other MCOCA and all those, acts which, takes away the rights of the people, are, they are also included. We can include them as, in this kind of movement. And the fourth one will be those tribals who had been fighting for their right to self-determination. When I say right to self-determination, I'm meaning of external self-determination, which is coterminous with sovereignty or independence. And the case is very clear. The Naga case is one, and others also. So these are some clarifications of the movements, and today we'll not be able to expound it or take the cases that we should be addressing. And maybe in the next lecture we'll be taking up some of the cases of the tribal social movements in different parts of India or in different parts of the world. For today, we should try to wind up by recapitulating what we had discussed. We discussed about the definition of tribe or indigenous peoples. Then we have also discussed the concept of ethnic group and ethnicity and the differences, the various theories and approaches of ethnicity put forward by different theorists, anthropologists and sociologists. Then we have also tried to understand tribal movements and ethnicity with special reference to India. So for today, we can conclude it with this, and next time we'll try to take up something more And of course, like I said, this lecture is quite relevant to ASO 12 and 14 of BA or BDB, MSO 001 and 004, and MPhil course, which is specifically given social movements. Now we would like to call it RSO 003, even MPhil course, which was launched from this year, June, is specifically given to a topic called social movements. So all, even BA, MA, and MPhil students will benefit by, trying to go into these lectures. If you don't get the access in this lecture, maybe you can get CD or whatever. And if you have some queries, you are most welcome to email me, or you can telephone me. It is in the website, and you can address to the sociology department. You can see the website of IGNU and sociology department, and we'll be very glad to answer your questions. For today, thank you for joining me, and good night.